Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Stuart McMillan had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he owned the largest construction company in Oregon, with contracts spanning 3 states. His calloused hands told the story of a man who'd climbed from laying concrete to signing million-dollar deals. But those same hands could be gentle when tucking in his 6-year-old son, Tommy, or when they traced the curves of his wife's face in the early morning light. Or so he thought. Carmen McMillan had been his college sweetheart, a psychology major with dreams of helping troubled children. Now 38, she ran a successful therapy practice from their Victorian home overlooking the Willamette River. Her auburn hair caught the Oregon sun perfectly, and her green eyes had once held promises of forever. They'd been married 15 years, and Stuart believed he knew every freckle on her porcelain skin. Tommy was their miracle baby, born after years of trying. He had Stuart's determined chin and Carmen's quick wit. The boy was Stuart's shadow on weekends, following him around construction sites in a tiny hard hat, asking endless questions about cranes and concrete. The McMillan family appeared perfect to their Portland neighbors. Stuart's company sponsored Little League teams. Carmen volunteered at the Children's Hospital, and Tommy was the kind of kid who brought home stray cats and shared his lunch with classmates who forgot theirs. But perfection, Stuart would learn, was often the most elaborate lie. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday evening. Stuart was reviewing blueprints in his home office when he heard Carmen on the phone in the kitchen, her voice lower than usual. "No, he's working late again." "Yes, I know. I miss you too." When he asked about it later, she claimed it was her sister, Vicky Delaney, going through a rough divorce. Stuart had met Vicky's husband, Edgar Cameron, at family gatherings. Edgar was a forest ranger, quiet and dependable. It seemed odd that Vicky would be having marital problems, but Stuart filed it away. Carmen was protective of her family's privacy. The second crack came the following week. Stuart's business partner, Randolph Callahan, mentioned seeing Carmen at a downtown restaurant with a man who wasn't Stuart. "Probably just a client," Randolph had said, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. Stuart began paying attention. Carmen's therapy sessions were running later. She started going to the gym more frequently. New clothes appeared in her closet, clothes that seemed designed for someone other than her husband of 15 years. But it was the way she looked at Tommy that truly unsettled Stuart. There had always been something different in her eyes when she watched their son, a distance that Stuart attributed to postpartum depression that never quite lifted. Now that distance seemed deeper, colder. Stuart's own childhood had been brutal. Raised by a father who solved problems with his fists and a mother who disappeared into bottles of vodka, Stuart had learned early that the world respected strength and punished weakness. He'd sworn his son would never experience the kind of uncertainty, that Tommy would grow up knowing his father was a man who could protect what mattered. That conviction would soon be tested in ways Stuart never imagined. Chapter 2. The Web Unravels. Stuart's spine surgery was scheduled for a Thursday in late September. A herniated disc had been causing excruciating pain for months, the result of decades of physical labor. Carmen had seemed almost eager about the timing, mentioning how it would give her parents, Edgar and Joan Cameron, a chance to spend quality time with Tommy. The Camerons lived 2 hours north, near the Columbia River. Edgar, despite being Vicky's ex-husband, had remained close to Carmen's family. He was in his early 50s, weathered and lean from years in the Forest Service, with steel-gray eyes that seemed to see everything. Joan was a retired elementary school teacher, soft-spoken but observant. What Stuart didn't know was that Edgar Cameron was no longer Carmen's ex-brother-in-law. 6 months earlier, after Vicky discovered Edgar's affair with her sister, the divorce had been finalized. But Carmen and Edgar had convinced both families that they were merely supporting each other through difficult transitions. The real relationship had begun 2 years ago during a family camping trip. Carmen had been feeling trapped in her marriage, craving excitement that Stuart's stable, predictable love couldn't provide. Edgar represented everything Stuart wasn't. Unpredictable, dangerous, willing to take what he wanted regardless of consequences. Their affair had started as emotional support and escalated into something darker. Edgar had convinced Carmen that Stuart was holding her back that Tommy was a burden preventing her from living her true life. He'd planted seeds of resentment that Carmen watered with her own selfish desires. On the morning of Stuart's surgery, Carmen kissed him goodbye at the hospital with what he thought was love, but was actually relief. She was finally free to spend an uninterrupted weekend with Edgar, using Tommy's fishing trip as cover. The plan was simple. Edgar would take Tommy fishing at their remote cabin while Carmen stayed in town, claiming she needed to care for her recovering husband. But Edgar had other intentions. He saw Tommy as competition for Carmen's attention and resources. In his twisted logic, if something happened to the boy during an accident, while fishing, Carmen would finally be free to start new life with him. Carmen, drowning in her own selfishness and Edgar's manipulation, had agreed to look the other way. Tommy, innocent and trusting, was excited about his fishing adventure. He'd packed his favorite superhero backpack and made Stuart promise to take him again once he was feeling better. Stuart watched from his hospital bed as Carmen led their son away, never imagining it would be the last time he'd see Tommy alive. The surgery went well, but recovery was slow. Stuart spent Thursday night in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness. He tried calling Carmen several times, but her phone went straight to voicemail. By Friday evening, concern was creeping into his drug-addled thoughts. Edgar's cabin was 40 miles from the nearest cell tower, surrounded by dense wilderness that had swallowed countless hikers over the years. It was the perfect place for an accident. Tommy spent Friday exploring the riverbank with Edgar, catching small fish and collecting smooth stones. He called Stuart that evening from Edgar's satellite phone, chattering excitedly about a bald eagle he'd seen and the 3 trout they'd caught for dinner. "Dad, when you're better, can we come back here together?" Tommy asked, his voice bright with hope. "Of course, buddy," Stuart had whispered, his throat tight with medication and emotion. "We'll catch even bigger fish." It was the last conversation they would ever have. Chapter 3. The Fall. Saturday evening arrived with an autumn chill that cut through the cabin's thin walls. Edgar had spent the day drinking beer and watching Tommy with growing irritation. The boy was too much like Stuart, earnest, trusting, always asking questions. Every smile, every laugh was a reminder of the life Edgar was trying to steal. As dusk painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Edgar made his move. "Hey, sport, want to check the fishing spots downstream?" he asked Tommy, who was building a fort out of river rocks. "Sometimes the big ones bite right before dark." Tommy's eyes lit up. He grabbed his small fishing rod and followed Edgar along the narrow trail that hugged the riverbank. The path was treacherous in places, with loose rocks and sudden drops. Edgar had scouted it earlier, identifying the perfect spot. What Edgar didn't know was that Tommy had secretly brought his mother's old cell phone, a device Carmen had given him for emergencies only. The phone had no service at the cabin, but as they moved downstream, it caught a weak signal from a distant tower. When Edgar suddenly shoved Tommy toward the river's edge, claiming he'd seen a huge fish, the boy stumbled and dropped the phone. As Edgar advanced with murderous intent, Tommy managed to grab the device and hit speed dial for his father. "Dad, they left me here. I'm scared," Tommy whispered into the phone, his 6-year-old voice trembling with terror he couldn't understand. Stuart, still groggy from medication, initially thought it was a bad dream, but the fear in his son's voice cut through the pharmaceutical haze like a blade. "Tommy? Where are you? What's wrong?" The line went dead. Stuart immediately called Carmen, his hands shaking as he punched in her number. When she answered, her voice was breathless, and he could hear music in the background. "Where's Tommy?" Stuart demanded. "He's with my parents, remember? At the cabin." But there was something wrong with her tone, a brittleness that Stuart had never heard before. "He just called me. He said they left him. He's scared, Carmen. Something's wrong." That's when Carmen revealed her true nature. Perhaps it was the wine, or the stress of maintaining her lies, or simply the narcissistic belief that Stuart was too weak to do anything about it. Her mask finally slipped. "He's dead weight. I should have dumped years ago," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom. Just like his pathetic father. The words hit Stuart like physical blows. In that moment, 15 years of marriage evaporated, replaced by a clarity so sharp it cut through his very soul. The woman he'd loved, the mother of his child, had just revealed herself as something monstrous. But Stewart was in a hospital bed, barely able to stand. He could only lie there, helpless, as the horrible truth crashed over him. He called the police immediately, his voice hoarse with desperation as he explained the situation. Search and rescue teams were dispatched to Edgar's cabin, but the remote location and approaching darkness made the search treacherous. Stewart discharged himself against medical advice, ignoring his doctor's protests and the searing pain in his back. He drove through the night, following police vehicles through winding mountain roads to Edgar's cabin. They found the cabin empty. Edgar's truck was gone, and there were signs of a hasty departure. Tommy's superhero backpack sat abandoned on the cabin's porch, a heartbreaking reminder of childhood innocence. The search continued through the night and into Sunday morning. Stewart, barely able to walk but driven by desperate love, joined the teams combing the riverbank. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. At dawn on Sunday, a searcher's voice crackled over the radio. "We found something." The body was caught in a debris jam 2 miles downstream from the cabin. Small, still, wearing the Superman t-shirt Stewart had bought him just the week before. The police officer who delivered the official news was a veteran with 20 years of experience, but his voice broke as he spoke. "Mr. McMillan, I'm sorry to inform you. We pulled a small body from the river. It's your son." Stewart fell to his knees on the rocky shore, his anguished howl echoing across the water. But beneath the grief, beneath the rage that threatened to consume him, something harder was crystallizing. Stewart McMillan had built an empire through determination and ruthless focus. Now he would use those same skills for a different kind of construction project. He was going to build Carmen and Edgar's destruction, brick by bloody brick. Chapter 4. The Revelation. 3 days after Tommy's funeral, Stewart sat in his empty house, surrounded by casseroles from neighbors and sympathy cards he couldn't bear to read. Carmen had moved out the day after their son's body was found, claiming she couldn't handle Stewart's accusations and paranoia. She was staying with friends, she said, though Stewart suspected she was with Edgar. The police investigation had concluded that Tommy's death was a tragic accident. Edgar claimed the boy had wandered off while he was setting up camp, and by the time he noticed Tommy was missing, it was dark. A desperate search had yielded nothing until morning brought the heartbreaking discovery. Carmen corroborated Edgar's story, playing the grieving mother perfectly. She spoke of how Tommy had always been impulsive, how he'd probably seen something interesting by the water and lost his footing in the dark. But Stewart knew better. The phone call, Carmen's venomous words, the timeline that didn't quite add up, it all painted a picture of deliberate murder disguised as misfortune. The problem was proving it. Stewart's lawyer, Randolph Callahan, had also been his friend since college. Randolph was one of the few people who knew the real Stewart, the man who'd fought his way out of poverty through sheer will and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty when necessary. "The cops aren't going to reopen this case," Randolph said, reviewing the police report in Stewart's living room. "Edgar's story holds up, and Carmen's backing him, without evidence of foul play." "Then I'll find the evidence myself," Stewart said, his voice carrying a coldness that made Randolph shift uncomfortably. "Stewart, I know you're hurting, but you need to be careful. If you go after them and you're wrong." "I'm not wrong." Stewart's certainty was absolute. "Carmen showed me who she really is. Now I need to find out how long this has been going on." Stewart's first discovery came from an unexpected source, Tommy's school. When he went to collect his son's belongings, the principal, a kind woman named Michelle Mason, pulled him aside. "Mr. McMillan, I probably shouldn't say this, but Tommy mentioned some things that concern me." She led Stewart to her office and closed the door. "About 2 months ago, Tommy drew a picture during art class. It showed your family, but there was another man in it. When I asked him about it, he said, 'Mommy's friend Edgar comes over when Daddy's at work.'" The words hit Stewart like physical blows. His son had known about the affair. "There's more," Michelle continued gently. "Tommy asked me if it was normal for mommies to cry when they looked at their little boys. He seemed to think he'd done something wrong. Stewart thanked Michelle and left the school with Tommy's belongings, but also with something else. Confirmation that Carmen's coldness toward their son hadn't been his imagination. That evening, Stewart began his investigation in earnest. He hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Ross Medina, who specialized in matrimonial cases. Ross was ex-military, discreet, and unencumbered by the moral qualms that might stop others. Within a week, Ross had uncovered the depth of Carmen and Edgar's deception. Bank records showed Edgar had been making regular deposits into a joint account he shared with Carmen, an account Stewart never knew existed. Credit card statements revealed romantic dinners, hotel stays, and purchases of jewelry that Stewart had never seen Carmen wear. Most damning of all, Ross had traced Edgar's movements in the days before Tommy's death. Edgar had researched the area around his cabin extensively, printing maps and studying water currents. He'd also made several purchases at sporting goods stores, rope, weights, and waterproof containers. He was planning something, Ross told Stewart as they reviewed the evidence. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated, but Stewart wanted more than evidence. He wanted to understand the full scope of their betrayal, to know exactly what kind of monsters he was dealing with. The answer came from an unexpected source: Vicky Delaney, Carmen's sister and Edgar's ex-wife. Stewart found Vicky living in a small apartment across town, her life clearly diminished since her divorce. She answered the door with suspicious eyes, but when she saw Stewart's grief-stricken face, her expression softened. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Over coffee and tears, Vicky revealed the truth that had been festering in her conscience since Tommy's death. "I knew about the affair," she admitted. "I've known for months. Edgar, he's not the man people think he is. He's charming on the surface, but underneath he's selfish and cruel. When we were married, I caught him." She paused, struggling with the words. "I caught him being inappropriate with a neighbor's daughter. She was only 12. Stewart's blood turned to ice. "Did you report it?" "The girl's family moved away before I could do anything. Edgar convinced me I was overreacting, that I'd misunderstood what I saw. But I knew, and I think Carmen knows too. She just doesn't care." Vicky reached into a drawer and pulled out a flash drive. "I copied some files from Edgar's computer before a divorce was finalized. I was going to use them if you try to take half my assets, but after what happened to Tommy, I think you should have them." The files contained Edgar's private correspondence, including emails with Carmen that went back 2 years. The messages started as emotional support during Vicky's difficult period, but quickly escalated into explicit planning for their future together. But it was the final exchange, sent just days before Tommy's death, that confirmed Stewart's worst fears. "Edgar, are you sure about this? Once it's done, there's no going back. Carmen, he's the only thing keeping us apart. I can't do this anymore, Edgar. I won't. Edgar." Then it's settled. One way or another, after this weekend, we'll be free. Stewart stared at the screen until his vision blurred with rage. They had planned to murder his son. His wife, the woman he'd loved for 15 years, the mother of his child, had conspired to kill their boy. That night, Stewart sat in Tommy's room, surrounded by toys and drawings and all the innocent debris of a life cut short. He held his son's favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons, and made a promise. "I'm going to make them pay, buddy," he whispered into the silence. "I'm going to make them pay for every tear you cried, every moment you were scared, every breath they stole from you." Stewart McMillan had always been a man who kept his promises. Chapter 5, The Hunter. Stewart's transformation began with meticulous planning. He'd spent decades learning how to build things that would last, and now he would apply those same principles to Carmen and Edgar's destruction. But this wouldn't be a simple matter of evidence and justice. The legal system had already failed his son. This would be personal, brutal, and absolute. The first step was establishing his new identity. To the outside world, Stewart remained the grieving widower trying to piece his life back together. He returned to work, attended grief counseling sessions, and maintained the facade of a broken man slowly healing. But privately, Stewart was becoming something else entirely. He'd always been physically strong from years of construction work. But now he began training with purpose. Pre-dawn runs through the forest, hours at the gym, and combat training with Nathan Bolton, a former Special Forces operator who now worked as Stewart's head of security. "You sure about this path you're going down?" Nathan asked one evening after a particularly brutal training session. Nathan had seen the change in Stewart, the cold calculation replacing grief. "They killed my son," Stewart replied, rapping his bruised knuckles. "The law won't touch them. So I will." Nathan nodded slowly. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and understood that some evils required direct action. "Then we do this right. No witnesses, no evidence, no way back to you." While Stewart trained his body, Ross Medina helped him map his target's vulnerabilities. Edgar had a drinking problem that was getting worse since Tommy's death. Guilt or celebration, it didn't matter. Carmen had developed an expensive cocaine habit, funded by life insurance money from Tommy's death. They were already destroying themselves, but Stewart wanted to accelerate the process. Stewart's first move was financial. Using his connections in the construction industry, he began systematically sabotaging Edgar's career. Anonymous tips about his drinking reached his supervisors. Environmental violations were reported at sites where Edgar worked. His reputation, built over 20 years of forest service, crumbled in months. Carmen's practice suffered a similar assault. Stewart hired actors to pose as troubled patients, people who would create chaos in her waiting room and then disappear. Professional complaints were filed citing ethical violations, inappropriate relationships with clients, breach of confidentiality, suspected drug use during sessions. Within 6 months, both Edgar and Carmen were facing financial ruin. But Stewart was just getting started. The psychological warfare began in earnest during winter. Stewart had Ross-planned evidence that Edgar was cheating on Carmen with multiple women. Photos of Edgar with escorts, credit card receipts from adult establishments, love letters written in Edgar's handwriting all found their way to Carmen. Simultaneously, Carmen began receiving evidence of Edgar's true nature. Copies of police reports from incidents Vicky had mentioned, testimony from other women who'd experienced Edgar's predatory behavior, and most damning of all, security footage Ross had obtained showing Edgar watching children at public playgrounds. Stewart wanted them to turn on each other, to tear apart the relationship built on his son's grave. The plan worked perfectly. Carmen confronted Edgar about the cheating evidence, leading to violent arguments that neighbors reported to police. Edgar, paranoid from drinking and suspicious of everyone, became convinced Carmen was setting him up. Their toxic love affair began poisoning itself, exactly as Stewart intended. But Stewart's masterpiece was yet to come. He'd purchased property adjacent to Edgar's cabin through a shell corporation, giving him access to the site where Tommy died. There, in the place where his son had taken his last breath, Stewart began constructing something special. Working alone at night, using skills honed over decades of construction, Stewart built a fortress designed for one purpose: to hold Edgar and Carmen while he extracted the justice the system had denied his son. The structure was hidden in the forest, accessible only by footpaths that Stewart had carefully concealed. It was soundproof, secure, and equipped with everything he would need for what came next. Stewart also began reaching out to people Edgar had wronged over the years. Vicky provided names and contacts, leading Stewart to a network of women who'd suffered under Edgar's manipulation and abuse. Some wanted revenge, others just wanted acknowledgement of their pain. Among them was Denny Kirby, a former co-worker whose teenage daughter had been one of Edgar's victims. Denny had spent years trying to get justice through proper channels, only to watch Edgar manipulate the system and escape consequences. "I'd do anything to see that bastard pay," Denny told Stewart when they met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland. "Anything." Stewart looked across the table at this broken mother, seeing his own rage reflected in her eyes. "What if I told you there was a way?" By spring, 1 year after Tommy's death, Stewart had assembled his pieces. Edgar and Carmen's lives were in ruins, their relationship toxic and violent. A network of Edgar's victims stood ready to provide alibis and support. The facility where justice would be served was complete and waiting. All that remained was springing the trap. Stewart made his final preparations with the methodical care of a man building a skyscraper. Every detail was checked and double-checked. Every contingency was planned for. He'd learned from his father's mistakes. Violence without planning was just brutality. But violence with purpose, violence with precision, was justice. On the anniversary of Tommy's death, Stewart visited his son's grave one last time before the endgame began. "Tomorrow it starts, buddy," he whispered to the small headstone marked with angels and superhero symbols. "Tomorrow they pay for what they did to you." The wind through the cemetery trees sounded almost like approval. Chapter 6. The Trap. Stewart's plan required Edgar and Carmen to come to him willingly, and he knew exactly which bait would work. The promise of money and escape from their crumbling lives. Through Ross Medina, Stewart orchestrated the perfect setup. An anonymous buyer, supposedly interested in Edgar's cabin property, reached out through a real estate agent. The offer was substantial, enough to pay off Edgar's debts and fund a new start somewhere far from Oregon. The catch was that the buyer insisted on a private viewing at the property, and he wanted to meet both Edgar and Carmen to discuss future development plans that might include Carmen's expertise in family counseling. Edgar, desperate for money and eager to escape the increasingly violent arguments with Carmen, jumped at the opportunity. Carmen, high on cocaine and paranoid about their financial situation, saw it as their last chance to salvage something from the wreckage of their lives. They agreed to meet the buyer at Edgar's cabin on a Saturday evening in late September, exactly 1 year and 1 month after Tommy's death. Stewart spent the week before the meeting making final preparations. He moved supplies to his hidden facility, tested all security measures, and confirmed his backup plans. Nathan Bolton would be waiting at a secondary location with equipment and support. Ross Medina would monitor police communications and provide early warning of any complications. Most importantly, Stewart prepared himself mentally for what was about to happen. He'd crossed moral lines in building his trap, but what came next would take him into territory from which there was no return. He was about to become judge, jury, and executioner. The thought didn't trouble him. Tommy's killers deserved worse than anything Stewart planned to give them. Saturday arrived with autumn rain that turned the mountain roads treacherous and provided perfect cover for Stewart's activities. He arrived at Edgar's cabin in the late afternoon, using his property access to approach unseen through the forest. The cabin sat empty, exactly as it had the night Tommy died. Stewart spent an hour there, remembering his son's last phone call, feeding his rage until it burned white-hot in his chest. When Edgar's truck pulled into the clearing at dusk, Stewart was ready. Edgar stepped out first, his movements cautious and paranoid. Months of drinking and stress had taken their toll. He was thinner than before, his eyes darting constantly, as if expecting attack. Carmen emerged from the passenger side, her designer clothes incongruous against the wilderness setting. Even from a distance, Stewart could see the nervous energy that marked her cocaine use. They approached the cabin warily, calling out for the mysterious buyer. When no one answered, Edgar pulled out his phone to call the real estate agent. That's when Stewart made his presence known. "Hello, Edgar." "Carmen." They spun toward his voice, and Stewart saw the exact moment they realized who he was. Edgar's hand moved instinctively toward the hunting knife on his belt, while Carmen took a step back toward the truck. "Stewart," Edgar said, his voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" Stewart emerged from the tree line, his appearance shocking them both. The grieving widower they remembered had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Months of training had added muscle to his frame, and his eyes held a coldness that made both of them shift nervously. "I came to see where my son died," Stewart said conversationally. "Imagine my surprise when I discovered you two were planning to profit from selling the place where you murdered him." "That's insane," Carmen said, but her voice cracked with fear. "Tommy's death was an accident. You know that." Stewart smiled, and the expression was terrible. "I know a lot of things, Carmen. I know about your bank account. I know about your emails. I know about your plan." Edgar's hand closed around his knife handle. "You're talking crazy, Stewart. Grief has made you paranoid." Stewart interrupted. "Is that what you told the police?" that the grieving father was just imagining things. Stewart pulled out his phone and played an audio recording. Carmen's voice filled the clearing, venomous and clear. "He's dead weight. I should have dumped years ago." Carmen went white. Edgar drew his knife. "You recorded me," Carmen whispered. "You bastard, you." "I recorded my wife telling me she wanted our son dead," Stewart corrected. The rest was just connecting the dots. Edgar raised the knife. "This is over, Stewart. You're not going to ruin our lives with your crazy theories." "Our lives are already ruined," Carmen snapped at Edgar. "Thanks to your incompetence. We're broke and under suspicion. Maybe if you'd been smarter about—" "About what?" Stewart asked, stepping closer. "About how you killed Tommy. About how you planned it. About how you celebrated afterward." The accusations hung in the air like poison. Edgar and Carmen looked at each other, and in that moment of distraction, Stewart struck. Nathan Bolton had taught him well. The taser caught Edgar center mass, dropping him convulsing to the ground. Carmen tried to run, but Stewart was faster and stronger. His hand closed around her throat, and he felt the same rage that had sustained him for a year crystallize into cold purpose. "You're going to pay for what you did to my son," he whispered in her ear as she struggled. "Both of you. And when it's over, the world will know exactly what kind of monsters you are." Carmen's last conscious sight was Stewart's face, transformed by grief and rage into something inhuman. Then the chloroform-soaked cloth covered her mouth and nose, and darkness claimed her. Stewart zip-tied both unconscious bodies and loaded them into Edgar's truck. The real estate meeting had been fiction, but the location Stewart had given was real, coordinates that led deep into the forest, to the facility he'd spent months preparing. As he drove through the rain-soaked wilderness, Stewart felt a strange peace settle over him. The planning was done. The trap was sprung. Now came the justice his son deserved. Tommy would finally be avenged. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The facility Stewart had built was a monument to patient rage. Hidden 3 miles from any trail, accessible only by a path he'd carve himself, it stood like a concrete tomb in the ancient forest. Inside, 2 soundproof rooms waited, equipped with everything Stewart needed to extract the truth and deliver justice. Edgar woke first, his body still twitching from the taser's effects. He found himself chained to a metal chair in a windowless room lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. The walls were bare concrete, and the only door was solid steel. When he tried to speak, he discovered his mouth was taped shut. Stewart entered the room, carrying a manila folder and a metal toolbox. He'd changed clothes during the drive, trading his casual wear for military-style fatigues that wouldn't show blood. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as he set the toolbox on a metal table. "Good morning, Edgar," Stewart said, removing the tape from Edgar's mouth with deliberate care. "I trust you slept well." Edgar immediately began yelling threats and denials, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Stewart let him rant for several minutes before holding up a hand for silence. "Are you finished?" Stewart asked politely. When Edgar continued screaming, Stewart picked up a cattle prod from the toolbox and touched it to Edgar's leg. The screams changed pitch. "I asked if you were finished," Stewart repeated. "I have things to show you, and I prefer your full attention." Edgar glared at him with murderous hatred, but remained silent. Stewart opened the manila folder and began laying out photographs on the table where Edgar could see them. They showed Edgar at various locations over the past 2 years, meeting Carmen in hotels, purchasing supplies before Tommy's death, disposing of evidence afterward. "Ross Medina is very thorough," Stewart explained conversationally. "Former police detective, knows how to track people without being noticed. He's been documenting your activities since I hired him." The photos painted a comprehensive picture of premeditation and cover-up. Edgar's face went pale as he realized how completely his actions had been recorded. "But pictures are just the beginning," Stewart continued. He pulled out a laptop and turned it toward Edgar. The screen showed a video feed from the next room, where Carmen was chained to an identical chair. "Your girlfriend is awake," Stewart observed. "Shall we bring her in for a reunion?" Stewart disappeared for a moment and returned dragging Carmen by her chains. She was conscious but clearly disoriented, cocaine withdrawal combining with fear to leave her shaking violently. "Stuart, please," she begged when she saw him. "I know you're angry, but this is insane. Let us go and we can work something out." "Work something out?" Stuart's voice remained eerily calm. "Like you worked out killing our son?" "We didn't kill anyone," Edgar snarled, finding his voice again. "Tommy's death was an accident." Stuart nodded, as if considering this. Then he opened his toolbox and began removing items one by one. A hammer, pliers, a blowtorch, various knives. Each tool was placed precisely on the table, and both prisoners grew quieter as the display continued. "You're right that I can't prove murder in court," Stuart said as he arranged his implements. "The evidence is circumstantial. A good lawyer might get you acquitted, might even convince a jury that a grieving father was seeing conspiracies where none existed." He picked up a pair of pliers and tested their grip. "But we're not in court, are we? Here, I don't need reasonable doubt. I just need the truth." Carmen began crying, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. "Stuart, please, I love Tommy. I would never." "You called him dead weight," Stuart interrupted, his voice finally showing emotion. "You said you should have dumped him years ago. I have it recorded, Carmen. Your own words." He walked to Carmen's chair and knelt beside her. "Tell me about the night he died. Tell me how Edgar pushed my son into that river." "I don't know what you're talking about," Carmen whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Stuart sighed and walked back to Edgar. Without warning, he grabbed Edgar's right hand and positioned the pliers around his index finger. "I'm going to break every bone in your body until you tell me the truth," Stuart said matter-of-factly. "Starting with your fingers and working my way up. Carmen gets to watch and think about her turn." Edgar's scream when Stuart crushed his finger echoed through the facility. Carmen vomited from fear and shock. "Tell me about Tommy's last moments," Stuart demanded, moving the pliers to Edgar's middle finger. "Tell me what he said when you pushed him." "Stop!" Carmen screamed. "Stop, I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything." Stuart paused, the pliers poised but not yet closed. "I'm listening." Through tears and gasps, Carmen began confessing. The affair had started as emotional manipulation, Edgar convincing her that Stuart was controlling and that Tommy was holding her back from happiness. Edgar had slowly planted ideas about how much easier life would be without the responsibilities of motherhood. He said Tommy would be better off, Carmen sobbed. He said the boy would never be strong enough for the real world, that we'd be doing him a favor. Edgar glared at her with pure hatred. "You stupid bitch, shut your mouth." Stuart crushed Edgar's middle finger, eliciting another scream. "She's talking. You should be grateful. It might save you some pain." Carmen continued her confession, describing how Edgar had convinced her that Tommy's death could look accidental during a fishing trip. She'd agreed because she was desperate to escape her old life and start fresh with Edgar. "But I didn't know he was going to do it that night," she insisted. "I thought we were just talking, planning for someday in the future." "Liar," Edgar snarled through his pain. "You knew exactly what was happening. You helped plan every detail." "Tell me about the phone call," Stuart demanded. "Tell me about my son's last words." Edgar, his hand now useless and throbbing, finally broke. "The little bastard had a phone. I didn't know until he called you. When I heard him talking, I finished what we started." "Ow!" Stuart's voice was barely above a whisper. "I held him under," Edgar admitted, his voice hollow with defeat. He struggled, but he was just a kid. It didn't take long. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Stuart felt something fundamental break inside him, the last restraint of civilization snapping under the weight of confirmed truth. Tommy had suffered. His son had died afraid and alone, murdered by the people who should have protected him. Stuart picked up the hammer. Chapter 8. Justice Served. What happened in that concrete room over the next 6 hours would have horrified a civilized observer. But Stuart was no longer civilized. He was a force of nature, a father's rage given physical form and directed purpose. Edgar lasted longer than expected, his Forest Service training giving him endurance that only prolonged his suffering. He confessed to every detail of Tommy's murder, admitting how they'd planned it for weeks, how they'd celebrated afterward, how they'd coached each other on their stories for the police. Carmen broke faster but suffered longer. Her cocaine-addled nerves couldn't handle sustained pain, and she began confessing to crimes Stewart hadn't even suspected. Affairs beyond Edgar, financial manipulations, even attempts to poison Stewart's food in the months before Tommy's death. "I wanted you gone," she screamed between sobs. "You were in the way of everything I wanted. Edgar said if you were sick enough, you might die naturally and we wouldn't have to wait." By the time Stewart was finished extracting confessions, both prisoners were broken in body and spirit. But he wasn't done with them yet. Stewart had brought recording equipment, professional-grade cameras that captured every word of their admissions. He'd also prepared legal documents, detailed confessions that would ensure their convictions if they somehow survived what came next. "Sign them," Stewart commanded, placing the papers in front of each prisoner. "Your full confessions to Tommy's murder." Edgar tried to refuse, but a few minutes with the blowtorch changed his mind. Carmen signed immediately, her hand shaking so badly the signature was barely legible. With the confession secured, Stewart prepared for the final phase of his plan. He'd brought plastic sheeting, industrial chemicals, and tools for disposal. Both prisoners would disappear completely, their bodies dissolved and scattered across the Oregon wilderness. But first, he wanted them to understand the full scope of their destruction. "Your lives ended the moment you touched my son," Stewart told them as he prepared the final implements. "But your suffering has only just begun." He showed them photos of Edgar's elderly mother, alone in her nursing home after losing her pension to his legal troubles. Pictures of Carmen's practice, permanently closed, and her clients transferred to other therapists. Evidence of the lawsuits and criminal investigations their confessions would trigger. "Everyone you've ever wronged will finally have justice," Stewart explained. "Your victims, your families, everyone whose lives you've poisoned. This confession will destroy your legacies completely." Edgar made one last desperate attempt at escape, using his remaining strength to break his restraints. But months of training with Nathan Bolton had prepared Stewart for this possibility. Edgar's attack was clumsy and weak, easily countered by a man who'd spent a year preparing for this moment. Stewart's response was swift and final. Edgar's neck snapped with an audible crack, his body going limp in an instant. The man who'd murdered Tommy died with his hands reaching uselessly towards Stewart's throat. Carmen's end was slower. Stewart wanted her to think about every choice that had led to this moment, every moment of selfishness and cruelty that had culminated in their son's death. When he finally ended her suffering, it was almost merciful. Stewart spent the rest of the night disposing of the bodies using techniques he'd researched for months. Industrial-grade, lye-dissolved flesh and bone, leaving only liquid waste that could be safely dispersed. By dawn, Edgar Cameron and Carmen McMillan had ceased to exist in any physical sense. The confession videos and documents went to Ross Medina, who would ensure they reached the proper authorities through untraceable channels. Edgar and Carmen's victims would finally receive acknowledgement of their suffering, and the justice system would close cases that had lingered for years. Stewart cleaned the facility methodically, removing every trace of what had occurred. The building itself would remain, a monument to a father's love and the lengths he would go to protect his child's memory. As the sun rose over the Oregon forest, Stewart drove home through the same mountains where Tommy had spent his last happy moments. But instead of grief, Stewart felt peace. His son's murder had been avenged, and the monsters responsible had paid the ultimate price for their crimes. Tommy could rest now, knowing his father had kept the promise made at his graveside. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 6 months after Edgar and Carmen's disappearance, their case officially went cold. The police investigation, hampered by lack of evidence and witnesses, concluded they had likely fled the country to escape their mounting legal and financial troubles. Stewart played his part perfectly, appearing at police interviews as the concerned ex-husband hoping for closure. He expressed confusion about their disappearance, worry about Carmen's mental state, and frustration with the lack of answers. To the outside world, he remained a grieving father, trying to rebuild his life after unimaginable loss. The confession videos Ross had delivered anonymously to law enforcement triggered a massive investigation into Edgar's past crimes. Multiple women came forward with allegations spanning decades, and several cold cases were reopened. Carmen's therapy practice faced posthumous scrutiny that revealed numerous ethical violations and potential criminal activities. The insurance company investigating Tommy's death ruled his case a homicide based on the new evidence, clearing the way for substantial wrongful death settlements. Stewart donated the money to organizations supporting child abuse victims, keeping only enough to maintain Tommy's grave and fund a scholarship in his son's name. Publicly, Stewart appeared to be healing. He returned to work with renewed focus, expanding his construction company into environmental restoration projects. He volunteered at children's hospitals and sponsored youth sports teams. To his community, he became an example of how even the deepest grief could be channeled into positive action. But those closest to Stewart saw the real change. Nathan Bolton, now his permanent head of security, recognized the predator that trauma had awakened in his employer. Ross Medina understood that his investigative services might be needed again for similar purposes. Stewart had discovered something about himself in that concrete room. He was exceptionally good at dispensing justice when the system failed. And there were many parents like him, people whose children had been hurt by predators who escaped legal consequences. The first request came from Denny Kirby, Edgar's former co-worker whose daughter had been victimized years earlier. The man responsible was still teaching, still in contact with children, protected by statute of limitations and institutional cover-ups. "I know what you did," Denny told Stewart during a private meeting at his office. "Ross let slip some details he shouldn't have. I'm not here to threaten you or turn you in. I'm here to ask for help." Stewart listened as Denny described her daughter's ongoing trauma, the failed police investigations, the teacher who continued victimizing children because the system couldn't touch him. When she finished, Stewart was quiet for a long moment. "Some problems require permanent solutions," he finally said. "Are you prepared for what that means?" Denny met his eyes without flinching. "My daughter will never be whole because of what he did to her. How many other children has he hurt since? How many more will suffer if someone doesn't stop him?" 6 weeks later, the teacher disappeared during a camping trip. His body was never found, but his computer yielded enough evidence to expose a network of predators that the FBI spent months dismantling. The second case came from a detective Nathan New, a cop whose hands were tied by politics and prosecutorial discretion. A wealthy businessman was trafficking children through his import business, but his connections kept investigations from moving forward. The businessman's empire collapsed overnight when his entire fleet of cargo ships suffered mysterious accidents in international waters. He disappeared shortly after, and the children in his network were recovered and placed in protective custody. Word spread carefully through channels known only to those who needed to know. Parents whose children had been failed by the system. Law enforcement officers frustrated by legal technicalities. Social workers who'd watched predators escape consequences time and again. They called Stewart the Carpenter, a reference both to his profession and his talent for building final solutions to problems that couldn't be fixed through conventional means. Stewart established a careful vetting process. Each case required overwhelming evidence of guilt and proof that legal remedies had been exhausted. He accepted no payment, though donations to his charitable foundation were welcome. Most importantly, each target had to be actively dangerous. Stewart wouldn't act against someone whose crimes were historical if they posed no current threat. 3 years after Tommy's death, Stewart stood at his son's grave on a gray December morning. The headstone was surrounded by flowers from the families he'd helped, though they would never know his true identity. Children were safer because of what he'd become, and their parents could sleep knowing their predators would never hurt anyone again. "I kept my promise, buddy," Stewart whispered to the small stone marked with angels. "The bad guys who hurt kids don't get to win anymore." A year later, Stewart met Michelle Mason at a charity function. The principal who'd first told him about Tommy's concerning drawings had left education to start a nonprofit supporting abused children. She was beautiful, kind, and understood the darkness that existed in the world without being consumed by it. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared purpose rather than passion. Michelle never asked about the shadows in Stuart's eyes or the scars on his knuckles. She saw only a man dedicated to protecting children and chose to love him despite the questions she didn't want answered. They married in a small ceremony attended by the family Stuart had helped and the law enforcement officers who'd become his unofficial partners. Tommy's picture sat on the altar next to their wedding flowers, a reminder that love and loss could coexist. Stuart never forgot the monsters who'd killed his son, but he'd channeled that memory into something productive. He'd become exactly what the world needed. A man willing to do what others couldn't, to go where others wouldn't, to ensure that children like Tommy received the protection they deserved. In the end, Carmen and Edgar had been right about one thing. Tommy McMillan had been dead weight in their selfish plans. But his death had created something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. A father with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Stuart McMillan had built an empire once through honest labor and determination. Now he'd built something else entirely, a legacy of justice that would protect children long after he was gone. And in the Oregon forest, hidden in a concrete room that would never be found, the tools of that justice waited patiently for the next monster who thought they could hurt a child and escape the consequences. Some fathers build tree houses for their children. Stuart McMillan built something much more permanent. He built fear in the hearts of those who would harm the innocent. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift he could give to Tommy's memory.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.